Hi, everyone. I was actually coming on to talk about plant-based diets after I watched The Game Changers on Netflix. I don't know how many of you have watched that documentary or not, or heard anything about it. I had been hearing a bunch of things about it, and so in our house last night we finally sat down and watched it. And I wanted to give not a rebuttal, but maybe a different perspective, because I think that when we're looking at documentaries, really any documentary, we need to be thinking about like what the perspective is and what gain there is to be made. And to be honest, I haven't really looked into that at all. But I also am not somebody that is so hard and fast feeling like we need to believe in one thing. And so I just wanted to offer a little bit of different perspective on a couple different key points that they made. So, one of the things that they really talk about is how inflammatory the eating meat is. And what we really need to be thinking about is that the quality of our food is what can cause inflammation if we're looking at just diet, right? Because there are so many other things that can contribute to inflammation in our lives. Stress, number one. If you're having any sort of cortisol release, you're going to have some inflammation from that. And then certainly we're going to have other dietary components that can be causing inflammation. What really causes inflammation is eating processed foods and excess sugar. So sure, there can be some inflammation when we're eating poor quality meat, but if we're eating the highest quality meat, grass-fed beef, all of our meat being raised without antibiotics or hormones, you're going to be less apt to have that inflammatory change. So I would be interested to see some of their articles and the studies that they are saying prove that causes inflammation. And then another point that they made, this is something that I'm super passionate about because I think it's fascinating. They make the point that high saturated fat intake and cholesterol intake is linked with cardiovascular disease or coronary artery disease. And basically what they say is that, it leads to plaque formation. So for sake of simplicity, in case you don't really understand, an artery is basically like a tube. Let's think of it as a straw. And so let's imagine that straw gets clogged up with, like when you're drinking something really thick and you can't get it through. That's essentially what the idea is behind cardiovascular disease, that we're getting this buildup. And so in order to get the blood through those arteries, our heart has to pump even harder. So that increases our blood pressure. So while it's true that cholesterol is what forms the plaques, those plaques aren't going to form unless we have little microvascular lesions. And what I mean by that is that we have high inflammation, typically from poorly controlled blood sugar, so high insulin spikes. And what that does is it causes these little tiny cracks in the lumen of our arteries. And that's an area where bacteria can get in. And when that bacteria gets in, we have an immune response. Monocytes come in and there's a reaction, something called foam cells are created. Well, then cholesterol can come in and bind to those foam cells, and then calcium also can kind of make those comes in, and it makes those plaques hard. That's very, very oversimplified, but you get the idea. So my point with all of this is that we're not going to get cardiovascular disease in the absence of inflammation from other sources. So one thing that I found really, really interesting in my education was that all of this literature that came out linking cardiovascular disease to, high fat intake to cardiovascular disease was done by a gentleman named Ansel Keys in the 1950s. And if we look at a lot of that literature, it's really, really not a sound study. And so, but this diet, I think it's called the diet heart hypothesis, I think, don't quote me on that, was kind of like taken to be gospel for so long and really implemented into a lot of our healthcare practices. And then later on in the 60s and 70s, researchers were starting to kind of catch on that, like, oh, maybe sugar is actually linked to cardiovascular disease. But those researchers were actually paid off to kind of bury that literature. And so think about how different things could be today if we knew what we knew now about sugar. another interesting thing with that is that one of the researchers that was instrumental in some of these studies showing a link between sugar and cardiovascular disease later went on to become, oh gosh, he really high up in the USDA, and so that just makes me, I don't know, question, makes me question the ethics that they had. Obviously, the government's willing to kind of buy, and the sugar industry, right? So whoever has the money, whoever has the power, is going to dictate a lot of that stuff. So I just love sharing that story. That was not very well articulated, but hopefully I get my point across. What else did I want to say about all of that? I think that it's really important that we consider, yes, we need to eat more plants in our diet. There's absolutely no question about that. I've never once told any of the clients that I've worked with that they need to eat less vegetables. Of course, plants need to be the basis of our diet, but I'm really not one for saying we've got to steer clear of meat for health reasons, because again, a lot of that literature is not super sound. I know that one study that they cited in that documentary they mentioned that heme iron intake is linked with cancer, and that's true, but only in a study where they were actually giving the animals heme iron. They weren't feeding the animals meat, they were just giving them heme iron, and as humans we don't really take that in, so I don't know that we can make that correlation carry over to human health and human nutrition. So I guess my point with all of that is that we really have to question these studies, and how many subjects, are they peer reviewed? Are they valid? Was there any sort of vested interest in this? So we really need to be critically looking at a lot of these studies that come out. It's really easy for somebody to come out and say literature shows, but we need to really be delving into that literature and seeing what that looks like. In all of this, like I said, my point is not to steer people clear of meat, or also not to say that people that are eating a plant-based diet are wrong, because I think the diet that's best for everybody is the one that's going to be free from processed foods, very low in sugar, if not free from all processed sugar, high in plants, and then yes, full of protein. If you are not eating animal sources of protein, it's true that you are going to have a harder time getting those complete proteins. And I think in this documentary, they downplayed the importance of getting those complete proteins. We really have to combine foods in such a way to get those complete proteins that maybe isn't going to be best for you. I know myself personally, I don't eat any grains, and so I'd be really hard pressed to get complete proteins into my system without those grains, if I wasn't eating meat. And why protein intake is really necessary is because that's what we're made out of. Protein synthesis is part of how we replicate our genes, how our cells replicate. And if we don't have adequate protein, that's where things are going to start to fall apart. And we're going to see things like injury and cell function starting to diminish maybe. So I really, really implore everybody to not, if you're somebody that was kind of always on the fence about meat, or maybe if you weren't, I really hope that you're not letting some of these documentaries come out that are really kind of scary steer you clear from meats, because meat can be a really, really important part of your diet. I know that I can speak personally that I was vegetarian for several years, 2 years of which I was pretty strict vegan. And for me personally, my health has improved immensely by adding animal protein back into my diet. Do I eat it all the time with every meal? No, but it is a very big staple in my diet. But I will tell you, the one thing I can say is that every single time I eat, and I tell my clients this all the time, if you don't want to eat a vegetable, don't eat. Every time you eat something green, eat a vegetable, and you're going to get health benefits from that. And of course, we want to be thinking about with those plants that we want those to be the highest quality too, because we don't want to be eating plant food sources that were grown with pesticides or GMOs, because guess what? That stuff's going to cause inflammation too. So hopefully this gave you guys a little bit different perspective on some of the proponents of purely going plant-based. out there. If you have any questions, please comment below. I'm really passionate about talking about this. I could ramble on for probably the duration of a documentary, but I won't do that. So I apologize for being abbreviated and maybe not particularly clear throughout, but hopefully you stuck with me. And if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks for watching.